Massive retaliation. But that sounds like atomic bombs. That's what it is. Okay. Well, but can he be more specific? He he doesn't want to be yet. Right. Okay. Yeah. August 4th, 1952. Your president helped you get the nomination to run to replace him. You may wish to thank him. You may praise his time in office, or you may quickly and publicly distance yourself from him and really say you are your own man. I'm Indy Neidell, and this is the Korean War. Last week in Chicago, the American Democratic Party nominated Adlai Stevenson as their presidential candidate. He will run against Dwight Eisenhower. There was more bombing action in the skies over North Korea, accusations at Panmunjom, and the end of the U.S. steelworkers strike, but because of the weather, there was little action in the field in Korea. However, now that the torrential rains have come and gone, the fight for the hilltop Old Baldy heats up again. The Chinese hold the crest with what the UN estimates to be 2 platoons. So the U.S. 23rd Infantry Regiment from U.S. 2nd Division sends up 2 reinforced companies, but only after artillery and mortars have rained fire on the enemy positions. When the 23rd guys get close to the enemy, they use hand grenades and small arms, and then close in to hand-to-hand combat, which is pretty intense. Finally, on August 1st, those 2 companies reach the crest and dig in to prepare for the inevitable counterattack. They light up 200 flares all around to see the enemy coming, though, and that night, after the communists shoot an estimated 2,500 mortar and artillery rounds at the crest of the hill, the physical counterattacks are repulsed. On the 2nd, the UN guys lay mines and barbed wire and build more bunkers, and today the 4th, another pretty heavy enemy assault is knocked back. The battle for Old Baldy proved that the enemy had as many, if not more, field guns as the UN. He could not, however, switch their fire or employ them as effectively as the Americans. A full battalion attack of the 1st Battalion from the 23rd Infantry retook the hill, a position that could accommodate comfortably only a single rifle company. There is plenty of bombing this week. Well, every week this summer. Today, August 4th, 5th Air Force fighter bombers again hit the North Korean capital, Pyongyang. This time, with 273 sorties making attacks against a fuel dump, gun positions, and buildings in general. I talked a bit last week about the stepping up of the UN bombing campaign against industrial targets, and no longer against the enemy rail system, and that enemy air power is often conspicuous by its absence. The reluctance of the communist fighters to defend their troops, cities, and plants offered a contrast to the efforts of the UNC Air Forces to afford their ground forces support during the summer of 1952. However, there had been complaints from ground force commanders regarding the Van Fleet Everest Agreement, which had specified that 96 close air sorties a day would meet 8th Army requirements under conditions of limited ground activity. Last December, 8th Army Commander Jim Van Fleet tried, although in vain, to get 1 fighter-bomber squadron attached to each of his corps, since he figured that would improve close air support work. This failed because parceling out combat units is contrary to Air Force doctrine, and they said such a system would not only be inflexible, but it would be wasteful since the squadrons couldn't be moved to more active battlefronts as they might be needed. Well, Matt Ridgway was UN commander at the time, and in early June, a few weeks after Mark Clark took over his post, Van Fleet tried again and suggested the 1st Marine Wing be put under the operational control of 8th Army. If this sounds any different, it's not. It's the same basic idea, putting 1 Marine Air Squadron with each corps and then having a joint operations center to coordinate it all. The difference this time is that to preempt the Air Force saying this wouldn't be flexible, he wants to maintain control at the Army level. so he can divert planes that are not being used as well as they might be to other corps who might need help, or even back to 5th Air Force. He figures the real benefit of doing things this way is there would be a shorter time lag between someone requesting air support and air support actually arriving. Also, the pilots would become more familiar with the terrain they'll mostly be attacking. They'll get to know the ground personnel pretty well. And if the planes are stationed fairly close to the core front lines, they'd be able to fly more sorties per day. Clark really does sympathize with Van Fleet in this, but he has an overriding concern. He does not wish to stir up what is an old feud between ground forces and air units on the specific role of tactical aviation. So at the beginning of July, he turned down Van Fleet's proposal. Clark, though, wanted at the very least to improve procedures for implementing ground-air operations doctrine. So he got his staff working on that, and he's ready to issue a plan for this. He did not find anything basically wrong with the present system. One of the difficulties he maintained was a lack of understanding at subordinate levels of the limitations of the air arm, and of the fact that air policies were only arrived at after consultation between the Air Force and Army commanders. Clark felt that ground commanders frequently called for airstrikes when their organic artillery could do the job better. See, the Far Eastern Command Air Forces have only a certain number of planes and different tasks to perform. They have anti-air missions, anti-installations missions, and anti-personnel missions. Ground support is not the least important of these, though it does usually get mentioned last. Clark figures that cooperative training between air and ground forces would eliminate a lot of the misconceptions there are. Van Fleet, meanwhile, has been meeting with Glenn Barkas, who took over command of 5th Air Force May 30th. These June meetings were about using maximum air power to destroy communist air offensive potential close to the actual battlefront, right? So he sees another reason to discontinue the railway system interdiction bombing, this one in favor of close support. Now, the one place they do encounter enemy air strength is night fighter opposition up near the Manchurian border. So Van Fleet asked Clark to let the B-29s doing raids up there instead hit enemy personnel and supplies near the front lines using nighttime radar-controlled bombing. Barkas is in favor of this. He informed Van Fleet that the air effort from the main line of resistance to areas 40 miles beyond the enemy front was growing substantially. But there were difficulties, he continued. Personnel and supply bunkers were extremely hard targets to destroy since the enemy was so well dug in. He tells Van Fleet that Jocko Clark, commanding the 7th Fleet, is eager to help out, and he, after a tour of the 8th Army front with Van Fleet, says that his naval aircraft are especially well suited for the sort of pinpoint attacks needed to hit enemy bunkers. So, with Van Fleet's blessings, he's got ready to join the close support program. So the number of air support missions grows and grows, with fighter bombers and medium bombers hitting the enemy's immediate rear. And this is way more satisfactory to the ground forces than the endless targeting of distant railways and other installations whose effect on the enemy at the front they couldn't really see nor measure. Air power has a variety of uses, and one of them is on display this week. With the week of torrential rains that just finished late last week, a lot of ground troops became isolated. The 3rd Air Rescue Squadron comes to their aid, but on the 30th it is pushed to its limits. Its helicopters rescue some 650 people in more than 100 sorties. Something that cannot help but have an effect on this war is this fall's American presidential election, since the current president, Harry Truman, who brought the U.S. into the Korean War, is not running. Democratic Party candidate Adlai Stevenson really was one of the most reluctant presidential candidates in history, but now that he's got the nomination, he has work to do. The Democratic convention ended July 26, and already just a few days later, he's distanced himself from the man who really did the most to get him the nomination, President Harry Truman. His campaign headquarters, he said, would be in the Illinois capital of Springfield. He fired the Democratic National Chairman, Frank McKinney, and replaced him with his own man, Stephen A. Mitchell, a Chicago lawyer. He also told the reporter one of his major goals would be to clean up the mess in Washington, a line that could have been lifted from the GOP platform. By this inadvertence, Truman fumed, Stevenson provided the Republican opposition with the audacity to go ahead with the two phony issues of the Eisenhower campaign, corruption and Korea. I want to look at Eisenhower's campaign for a sec here. At the convention, the Republican Party's foreign policy platform points were interesting. I mean, they really took Truman to task for everything from Yalta to China. But on Korea, they were pretty mild, basically only castigating Truman for not getting a formal congressional declaration of war. The man behind Eisenhower's foreign policy is John Foster Dulles, and he has made himself Ike's foreign policy advisor over the past 6 or 7 months. Here's a good explanation for why. Although he continued to serve the State Department as a special advisor through early January, Dulles had become increasingly critical of the Truman-Acheson doctrine of containment. Dulles realized that 2 decades of continuous power, with all their accretions of grievances, meant an imminent end to democratic rule. At the core of the problem was the Korean War. In the view of Townsend Hoops, a young Defense Department official, because its conduct ran so hard against the grain of war-making in the simpler American past, it was producing strains, anxieties, and problems of credibility that became fertile breeding grounds for the new unilateralism and a vicious demagoguery. Dulles hoped to be part of the new guard occupying Washington. Rather reflexively, Dulles cast his lot with Eisenhower. Dulles stumped for Ike over Robert Taft, Ike's chief rival for the nomination. Dulles thought Taft was way too isolationist and overly hostile towards Europe, and feels that the U.S. turning its back on European nations would be dangerously short-sighted. It's interesting how Dulles got Ike's attention in the first place, though. First by letters sent through Taft's old rival, former Republican presidential candidate Thomas Dewey, and also through retired General Lucius Clay, who was Ike's deputy in 1945 and ran the U.S. zone of occupation in Germany for a couple years. Dulles had an essay published in Life magazine May 30th outlining his views. He does approve of several things Truman got accomplished on his watch: the formation of NATO, the Marshall Plan, going into Korea, which he actually calls courageous, righteous, and in the national interest. But he thinks the overall American global policy just lurches from one emergency measure to the next and is reactive instead of proactive, and doesn't really address the roots of Soviet or communist expansion. As he puts it, right now, the U.S. is not working, sacrificing, and spending in order to be able to live without this peril, but to be able to live with it, presumably forever. Ours are treadmill policies which at best might keep us in the same place until we drop exhausted. Dulles' answer to this is the concept of massive retaliation. In his words again, there is one solution and only one. That is for the free world to develop the will and organize the means to retaliate instantly against open aggression by Red armies, so that, if it occurred anywhere, we could and would strike back where it hurts by means of our choosing. To Dulles, the U.S. is God's chosen agent to enforce moral or natural law. This law has been trampled by Soviet rulers, and for that violation, they can and should be made to pay. And you know, we have atomic weapons. We just need the will to use them, and use them instantly when needed. This stuff was all in that Life magazine article. And the editor who helped Dulles write it really pushed him to be more specific, like what exactly should U.S. policy do? But Dulles is intentionally vague, figuring that he's laid out the broad objectives, and they should let the Soviets wonder just how he intends to carry stuff out should Ike win the election. Eisenhower, in private, fretted about Dulles' views on massive retaliation. He also told C.L. Sulzberger of the New York Times he thought the attacks in the platform on Truman were a bit savage, but he made a pragmatic decision. He did not offer serious objection to the platform language because he needed the Taft wing of the party to win. And as far as specifics were concerned, Ike would work these out at his leisure over the next few months, which you will see right here. But my coverage of this week of the war is over. With more big action at little Old Baldy, more bombing of Pyongyang, Stevenson putting some distance between him and Truman, and Bud Hannings tells me in his Korean War trilogy that today, August 4th, according to U.S. records, 1,000 MiG planes have been shot down since the war began. Massive retaliation. Well, it has a lot going for it, I guess. I mean, as it stands now, only the U.S. has the atomic power to utterly destroy their enemy. Should they use it? That would kill an awful lot of people. It would also anger and alienate the rest of the entire world. It would create a lot of both hatred and satisfaction. But would it really achieve its goal? I mean, if atomic bombs obliterated China and the USSR as political entities, well, what if after that some African country declared it was now a communist nation? Would they get obliterated too? See, this is the kind of thing it would be nice if Dulles were actually specific about, because come January, he might be in a position to actually do it. If this war is still going on come January, then you can bet I'll be right here covering it, and that is thanks to the Time Ghost Army. You too can join the army and be part of all this at timeghost.tv or patreon.com. Armin Abele, or Abel, is the Army Member of the Week here, and these are the newest commissioned officers, and do not forget to subscribe, and I will see you next time.